Mchangizi here. It's been 1 year today since my first tweet about COVID back in March 10th of 2020. My first tweets on that day were trying to calm folks down. I could tell there was panic that was going to be happening, and one of my tweets then was even, panic is itself a kind of terrible consequence, and we can't anticipate the kinds of things that will happen if people keep prefacing the word COVID or coronavirus with the words deadly every time that they do it. And so one of the things I had mentioned was, you have to carry on because the economy and society depends on it. These were, to me, obvious things that everybody should realize, that the greatest threats at any given time aren't biological, they aren't hurricanes, they're the kinds of things that people do to one another, and it's usually by virtue of mass events that emerge out of all of us. Now, during this time that mass hysteria happened, not only did mass hysteria happen and sort of the mechanisms of free expression break down that led to this kind of positive feedback loops, which led to hysteria and mass delusion, but on its back, we also had centralized forces trying to control the narrative. We had big tech censoring and suspending folks that were not delivering messages that were on narrative. We had cancel culture going after folks and preventing folks from saying what they want. I have friends and many colleagues that would not research or publish anything related or even speak out on Twitter or social media concerning their skeptical views on the astronomical supposed risks of COVID and the supposed benefits of the interventions. What we knew back in early March was that COVID was a relatively cold flu-like virus that was several times more dangerous than your average flu if you're older than 60 or so and have comorbidities, but otherwise was flu-like, and if you were younger than, if you're in your 20s or younger, it was safer than flu and up to 20 times safer than flu for kids. So, and we also had no reason to believe that the interventions like lockdowns would work, and they were not standard practice at the time, and masks were shown over and over again to not work, and it's not why surgeons even ever wore them. They wore them to stop potentially spittle from landing in the wound, open wounds, not to stop the aerosols by which seasonal viruses spread. Now, 1 year into this, there's a bunch of new kinds of institutes, and I'm colleagues with many of these folks that are doing great work and arguing against the miscommunication of the data that journalists have done, that governments have done, that intellectuals have done. They're trying to set right the science and the data and the epidemiology. And they're certainly part and parcel of what has to happen to undo these sorts of mass hysteria and mass delusions. But ultimately, the problem that occurred is one that's quite deeper than data. It's not really a data problem at all. It's really a problem about free expression. It's about how free expression, the normal mechanisms by virtue of which free expression works and moves us slowly, troggling our way towards the truth, they broke down in this case. But what we don't want is censorship and fact-checking and things like this by virtue of, through government or any kind of centralized controllers. That's going to be much worse. So really, the kinds of events that occurred were psychosocial. And these are the kinds of things that need to be studied. What's at stake in these mass delusions and false narratives and censorship is freedom itself. If we're going to understand and preserve freedom and not fall into totalitarianism in that direction like we have been for the last year, we have to understand these mechanisms that undergird freedom, which is free expression itself. So my colleague and I, Dr. Tim Barber, have started a new research institute, a kind of think tank devoted to this. And it's called the FreeX.group, or FreeX. And the website is FreeX.group. And it's predicated on sort of three parts, like a tripod. The free is that what makes free expression free isn't just absence of government censorship. It's about big tech, private organizations, private individuals, respecting, having a culture where you don't go after and try to take people down by virtue of their speech. You don't try to suspend them. You don't, as a private company, suspend them. There has to be a culture of tolerance Without that culture of tolerance, you can have free speech all you want, but it doesn't mean anything because no one's willing to speak. Often the people that really control the conversation are the people out on the street. They're your neighbors. And if you're afraid to speak because they're all going to crash your career and crash your life, no one will speak. Free speech doesn't mean anything unless it's tolerated and understood, and its importance is understood. Well, in the free expression group, the second of these pillars is expression. And counterintuitively, when you think about free speech, your first thought is that the most important thing about free speech is that people are free to say these propositions, these sentences with words. But research that's going to be coming out by virtue of Tim Barber and I, research we've been doing over the last decade, and it's going to come out in this new book on the origins of emotional expressions. What's important about free expression is really expressions. It's about the emotional expressions that humans actually utter to one another. And one of the things that's broken in our modern social media is the ability to emotionally express to one another. The reason that we're not trolls to one another in real life is because we emotionally express. We're able to accumulate reputations on the basis of the degree to which we've been right over time, and that's by virtue of emotionally expressing our opinion and how confident we are about it. These things are communicated by virtue of emotional expressions, which push reputation at stake, and when we find out who was wrong or right, my reputation goes up or down accordingly. These mechanisms of free expression are undergirded by emotional expressions, not per se the speech itself. This is counterintuitive, but it's crucial for understanding how to move forward in terms of preserving free expression and making sure it works as the needed mechanism to undergird freedom itself. And finally, in the free expression group, the third pillar is group. To understand these kinds of forces, you have to understand how it works at the level of the group, at the level of the network whole. So these are mass effects that come out by virtue of all of us interacting in these many billions of pairwise, trillions of pairwise interactions between individuals. How do these things work together to create the kinds of reputation networks where you have them, people rising and lowering in a decentralized manner? And that's key to how it works. Science itself isn't a bunch of people rationally following rules and coming to conclusions. It's a gigantic community of folks rising and falling in reputation by virtue of the degree to which they're saying right things. That same thing happens at a much larger scales and much more in a messier fashion just in the social media itself, and by virtue of massive social networks. To make sure that they're functioning normally and that we don't have to worry about censorship and we can push and justify why you don't need fact checkers, we need to make sure that our mechanisms of free expression are functioning as they should. But first, we need to understand how is it that they actually should function. How did we evolve to have these social networks function so that we move towards truth, generally speaking? That's the goal of our research, at FreeX, is to understand these mechanisms and to communicate or express how important they are. Thank you.